On behalf of the Washington Tree Farm Program, I would like to welcome everybody to our fall Westside webinar. I have 5 things that I'd like to say. First, I'd like to mention 2 people who have recently passed. One is Elizabeth Lawrence, the wife of our Southwest Inspecting Coordinator, Chuck Lawrence. And the other is Bob Faulkner, a longtime leader in the tree farm program, who was not only State Tree Farmer of the Year in 2002 and National Tree Farmer of the Year in 2003, but was very instrumental in setting up the tree farm program in Washington State as it is today. And without him, we wouldn't be doing this seminar. We have a lot to thank Bob and a group of people around him for. Now, I'm going to share my screen. First, for those of you who are watching who are not certified tree farmers, I encourage you to join the tree farm program. If you've got 10 acres of forested land, and if you have a forest management plan, join us in proudly displaying the American Tree Farm System sign in front of your property. Secondly, those of you who are tree farmers have until Monday the 26th to get your photographs for the 2013 calendar that we do with the SAF. You've got about a week and a half left to do this. So get your photos into the photo contest. And next, thirdly, the quilt. There's still a chance to buy a chance to win the quilt. This is a fundraiser we're doing for to support our volunteer and tree farm inspectors. They are the backbone of our organization. So a $10 donation wins you a chance to get you a chance to win this quilt. We will be announcing that in early October. And finally, I'd like to recognize the people that made this today's program possible. Our Westside Technical Committee, which consists of Nick Kuntz, Patrick Schultz, Margaret Creeder, and Tom Westergreen. And thank you to today's speakers, for Bob Sleazak and Joe Shea, and to the property owners of the places we're going to visit tomorrow. That'll be Ken Osborne, Ruth Heft, and Dick Klein in the north, and the Cranberry Lake Foundation property, and the WSU field station on the south tour. I'll be on the north tour. I look forward to seeing you all then. So anyway, now back to you, Nick.
Thanks, Dave. So I just have a quick slide here, little reminders. We'll stay muted. If we have audio issues, you can text me in the chat. We'll be recording these sessions, and if you'd like to receive continuing education units, we'll have a survey in the chat at the end. But we'll also be sending that out via email, so just one response is necessary. And I'll be staying online at the end to answer questions about the field tours, so folks have questions. With that, Margaret, would you like to do the intro here?
All right, thanks, Nick. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for tuning in. Our first speaker here is going to be Dr. Rob Sleazak. He's a researcher with the U.S. Forest Service. Rob's research is focused on the effects of forest management and other ecosystem stressors on stand development and soil function, as well as development of mitigative actions or adaptive systems to minimize the detrimental effects of these stressors. Some of the current projects he's working on are assessments of the impacts of the emerald ash borer and black ash wetlands, the effects of invasive Scotch broom on soil and plant communities, organic matter removal, soil compaction, and soil stand factors in Douglas fir and aspen forests. And he's also leading the development of a new experimental network across the Western US to evaluate the use of assisted migration and other practices to increase reforestation success. Today, Rob's going to be talking to us about the benefits of slash retention in forest systems and why leaving slash in your forest should be something to consider in your management practices. Take it away, Rob.
All right, thanks a lot, Margaret. I appreciate that. And hearing you with that list off that bio, it always reminds me, even when I think I'm making them short, they always come across as so long when they're read out loud. So anyways, thank you very much for that, the introduction. Let me see if I can find my screen here. Going. And I'm not sure how you normally do this, but I'm very open to taking questions as I'm going through this. So I'm fine. If you want to interrupt and ask me a quick question, that's totally okay. It's also fine if you want to leave them till the end as well. But, just really, I feel this is kind of an informal opportunity for me to share kind of some of the work that we've been doing related to slash, and hopefully in a way that's beneficial to you. So again, if it's not clear to you and when I'm talking about something and you want to ask a clarifying question, then please feel free to do so. So should it stay or should it go? Talking about the potential benefits of slash, and this is very much specific to Western Washington. You know, depending upon where we are, the climate, various disturbance regimes slash some of what I'm going to talk about today might not be relevant or applicable, but at least for all of you who are, from what I understand, based in Western Washington, this should have some relevance to some of the management that you do. Before I get started into the meat of the talk, just want to acknowledge all the collaborators, in particular, Dr. Tim Harrington, he's a scientist emeritus at the PNW Research Station. He was really instrumental in initiating a lot of this work. I actually did my doctorate underneath him and then continued to work with him over the last 15 years or so on some of this work. He just recently retired a few years ago. Stephen Schoenholz also was instrumental in getting these studies started, and then Dave Peter, Kim Lipke, and Scott Hull have been great collaborators on it as well. And then lastly, I'd like to just acknowledge the partners, the landowners. It's funny, the Forest Service, we actually don't do a lot of research on our forests that much anymore because we don't, at least in the context of active management, because there isn't a lot of active management that happens. And so we're typically partnering a lot with others who are doing active management. And so in this case, Green Diamond and Port Blakely in particular, and then also Weyerhaeuser was involved in this research as well. All right, so just real quick where we're going over the next 40-ish, 45 minutes, something like that. I'm going to just give you some context, broad, ideas on, reforestation, thinking about in terms of management, objectives, adaptation strategies, things along those lines. Talk about the potential benefits of slash, and then really get into the research, showing you kind of what we've seen at a couple of different studies in terms of what some of those benefits might be, in particular focus on stand productivity in soils. I'm going to give you a specific example of how slash can have dramatic influence on Scotch broom, which is an incredibly invasive species if you're not familiar with it. And then we'll do a quick recap and hopefully highlight all of the primary points that I've made. All right, so just to start out, and I know with all of you being professionals, you're very intimately aware of this, but forest management, there are potential impacts associated with it if it's not done correctly. And so there's been just decades of work that's been done trying to figure out, as we go from this condition on the right, a second growth, old Douglas fir forest gets harvested, go to the condition on the right, post-harvest, maybe have a lot of slash retained. What does that mean in terms of long-term productive capacity of that forest? And not just like after one rotation, we're thinking hopefully as good stewards of the land, multiple rotations down the line. And in particular, in what we're talking about today and what a lot of interest of mine is thinking about what management practices we do can maybe alter those outcomes in some way, either to the benefit or detriment of the productive capacity of the land. All right, so when I think about reforestation, which what we're talking about today in terms of slash is one piece associated with that, there's kind of three basic things that we got to consider. One, and first is just thinking about what you want to plant, whether it's a species or maybe even thinking about genotypes within a species. It's especially true now with things like climate change, where maybe we're thinking about moving genotypes from more southerly latitudes or lower elevations, more northward to higher elevations that might be adapted to a future climate. Thinking about how and when to plant, so timing, whether it's maybe a fall plant to give a little additional root growth in the fall, or more just a typical spring plant, but coupled with a variety of different establishment practices, essentially trying to do things to increase, the success of short-term establishment but also hopefully trying to have success at increasing long-term objectives and resilience of the stand that you're growing. And lastly is, where to plant. And, I temper this a lot of times. I'm talking to large landowners where they have a, very large land base and they can kind of prioritize where they do their activities and the timing of their activities. And that might not necessarily be the case with many of you, but at the least thinking about what your site has in terms of its capacity and maybe what some of its limitations might be, and thinking about how you might adapt the practices that you use given those realities. All right, so again, kind of just starting off here, I do think it's critically important, whether you're thinking about what we're talking about here today with slash and vegetation control or other practices, it's really important to be thinking about the future and being very deliberate in terms of coming up with objectives and thinking about what you're going to have to do in order to achieve those objectives, and how you might incorporate them into a management plan. And so there's various things, frameworks that people have kind of developed to think about changing conditions, specifically associated with climate change and other changing conditions, disturbance regimes, and so on. One that's from the adaptive silviculture group is this resistance resilience transition framework. There's others that have been developed by like USGS, such as the resist, accept, direct framework. They're all essentially they're pointing out that there's different things that we need to be considering in how we do our management depending on what we're trying to achieve. So in this example, maybe something like a resistance strategy is something along the lines of you just want to do what you've always been doing. You want to manage Douglas fir rotations, even age, 50 years, maximize fiber revenue, and that's what you want to do, and you want to do it for the next rotation. And that's great, but it also means that you might want to be thinking about there's going to be additional things that you might need to do in order to have that be successful, given these changing conditions. The other end of the spectrum, you might go all the way to a transition strategy where you're thinking about like, okay, I recognize, I embrace the fact that there's things are changing, there's lots of risk and uncertainty associated with that, but I want to do some things a little bit different in order to maybe adapt to those future conditions. I'm just pointing this out because clearly this has influence in terms of like the duration of your rotation, the amount of investment that you would have to do. And it's just very helpful to be thinking very deliberately about what your objectives are and how you're going to achieve them, especially under all this uncertainty with the change that's going to be occurring over the next couple of decades. All right, so let's get into the practices. So that there's a lot of them that can be done. I'm sure many of you are very familiar with these practices. So slash retention, competing vegetation control, which we'll be talking a little bit about today. But some of these other ones that are maybe a little bit not as widely used. I mentioned time of planting earlier. Or fall planting if it's possible, or necessary given on where your site's located. Maybe if it has inaccessible planting opportunities in the spring. Thinking about stock types, bare root versus containerized, and again, what might be available to you, how that might increase short-term establishment success. Then even things are thinking about in terms of changing the densities that we might plant at, or the configurations that we might plant at. And these are probably more longer-term influences, decisions that we make at time of establishment, but they're going to have longer-term implications in terms of stand development and the way in which those stands function into the future under changing conditions. But today, again, we're very much focused on these top two, the slash being the dominant one, but I'm also going to talk about competing vegetation control as well, because the studies that I'm referencing, we incorporate both these practices into them. All right, so slash, this is, it's commonly piled and burned, or maybe utilized now with, supposedly some people have access to biomass markets for various things. And so maybe you could utilize that slash and recoup a little bit of value, having it utilized for biomass. Done for a variety of different reasons. Typically, it's, cited as just, to facilitate planting, maybe to reduce your short-term fire risk or potential for pests. If there's beetles that can infest in become abundant within slash piles, trying to reduce those. And oftentimes the answer is it's just what we do. It's always been done. It's what the loggers do. They come out, they harvest the stand, the slash is piled and it's burned. And that's fine. That's how it's been done. And that's a lot of times how things go. But at the same time, there's maybe some other things you want to consider. On the one side, I'm going to be talking about the benefits, but there is also maybe potential detriments with this method. So I'm showing you here in the picture in the upper right, this is actually an aerial view of a stand, lodgepole pine stand in the Intermountain West. And they had slash piled, burn, and then you can see 40 years later that you can still visually see the effects of that practice. And of course, this depends on the configuration, the type of the piles, the size of the debris that's in those piles, the conditions, and how hot the piles burn at, and lots of other factors. But it's just one risk that goes along with potentially just doing the same old, pile and burn it. All right, so on the flip side, there's lots of potential benefits of slash retention. And I'm going to show you some data related to these, but just to kind of give you the highlights of some of them. One is that we know it can modify plant competitive interactions. So just by its physical presence, it actually can favor certain vegetative forms than others. And many times this actually provides a benefit to the crop trees in terms of it limits the amount of competition that can be present on a site. Not always, but in many instances can have a beneficial effect in that regard. Certainly moderates the soil environment. So you can have lower less mild temperatures in the summertime, so not reaching lethal temperatures during some of our hotter heat events. Same time can also act like a mulch, where you can actually have increases in soil moisture availability simply because you're reducing near surface evaporation. Can also improve soil fertility. There's a lot of nutrients that are bound up within slash. Essential elements like nitrogen, very high concentrations within the foliage. You also have other macronutrients, phosphorus, calcium, magnesium. All of those elements, as the slash decomposes, slowly, for the most part, enter into the soil and then eventually become available for uptake by the stand as it grows into maturity over the course of the next rotation. There's anecdotal reports that it can inhibit large mammal browse. I think just intuitively, you look at like a big field of slash, like, well, I heard the deer, elk aren't going to go wandering through there compared to the neighbor's site that has a nice, clean situation where they don't have to kind of walk and move through the slash. I don't know how true this is. I've never seen good data on it, but it's commonly cited as potentially one benefit. And there's others as well, maybe improve biodiversity, even things like habitat for small mammals. All right, so now I'm going to get into some of the data and look at the studies that we've done looking at the effects of slash retention and vegetation control and how these treatments have influenced, as I said before, in particular soils in terms of nutrient pools, and also stand productivity in terms of growth. So these sites are part of the long-term soil productivity site. It's a study. It's a nationwide, or actually a North American-wide study where there's across all the major forested biomes within North America, there's these common experimental treatments applied where they have organic matter removal, which I'll use these terms interchangeably. Organic matter is the same as logging debris, is the same as slash, biomass. They're all the same thing, but they're organic matter removal treatments crossed with herbicide treatments. Then sometimes there's compaction treatments as well. We're fortunate enough to have 3 sites in the PNW region. I'll talk a little bit about those on the next slide. But at these 3 sites, we have 2 treatments that were applied. One was logging debris removal, where we had essentially what we'd call a whole tree harvest, where more of the logging debris or slash was removed from the site compared to where more of it was retained, in which we called a bowl-only treatment. And then the other factor was a vegetation control manipulations. One was a more typical kind of site preparation, one-time treatment prior to planting. And then the other treatment was continuous vegetation control for a period of 5 years. And this was done operationally, but more or less effectively controlled competing vegetation for that period of time. All right, so these 3 sites at which the experiment was installed, again, these are in the PNW region. So we got 2 of the sites are in Washington. One is the Matlock site, which is up near actually where you'll be on the field tour this weekend, up near Shelton on the Olympic Peninsula. And the other one's in Fall River, central western Washington. And then the third site's near the town of Molalla in Oregon, kind of in the lower Cascades. What's interesting about these sites, and something I'll emphasize as I go through some of the results, is they span a gradient in site productivity. And we can see this by looking at the table. So if you think of total soil carbon, which is kind of an indicator of soil organic matter, which is critically important for soil productivity, it's highest at Fall River, intermediate at the Molalla site, and then lowest at Matlock. All the other elements go along. So nitrogen is another example, follows that same trend. Water holding capacity generally follows that same trend. And of course, then site index follows that same trend as well. And really, you don't even have to look at the numbers. You just look at those soils. You know, the pictures really tell it, you know, just by looking at them. It should be pretty clear that the two on the left, Fall River and Malala, are relatively decent productivity soils. And the one on the right, developed in glacial outwash up on the Olympic Peninsula, just tons of coarse fragments, limited water holding capacity, limited nutrient availability, and just generally much lower soil quality, lower site productivity. One thing I want to highlight before I get into the actually showing the data here is that the logging debris treatments, it's not like a you know, a bare ground versus, you know, a wall of slash kind of scenario. These were operational treatments. So again, they were you know, what we call a bowl only treatment, where only the merchantable bowl was removed from the site and all the remaining slash was left, versus the whole tree. But in the whole tree treatment, you know, the trees are still felled, branches break off as the tree falls. And so it's not like you don't have any slash. And you can see from the estimates here, it was roughly about a twofold difference in slash retention. So just keep that in your mind. I'm not talking about like a totally bare ground scenario. These are very much operationally applied. It's better to think of them as kind of relatively less slash versus relatively more slash. I just throwing this up. There's a ton of papers on this. So if you have interest in this topic and you're you know, kind of piqued and want to learn a little bit more about it, please just get in touch with me after this, and I can send you any manuscripts. You know, we looked at things like soil properties, Douglas fir stand characteristics and productivity, vegetation communities, and many other aspects associated with that. And today I'm going to be talking specifically about some short-term findings, but also up to year 15. And most of what I'll be talking about is on the Malala and Matlock sites, simply because those are the ones that I've been most closely affiliated with. All right, so starting off with the short-term response in relatively small scale. So after these treatments were applied, of course, you know, like I said, they're operationally done. So there's a variety of conditions, surface conditions in each of the treatments. We went out and we just identified spots that had high amounts of slash, low amounts of slash. And then we found machine trails that had slash on them and machine trails that had bare soil, that had no slash on them. And we measured carbon and nitrogen at each of those spots. And so you can see that's this figure here on the left is showing the responses that we measured there. And so it's going on this nice stair-step gradient, where as you go on a gradient of decreasing slash and increasing soil disturbance, you get a reduction in carbon and a reduction in nitrogen. And that's just a really clear signal, really clear indicator that slash and the amount of disturbance associated, at least with the machine trail, influences carbon and nitrogen concentrations. On the flip side, we look at the treatment with the vegetation control. We went and measured as one really good indicator was nitrogen. You know, it's an essential element, generally most limiting to growth. You know, we commonly fertilize with it because of that. And so we went and measured available nitrogen, looking at ammonium and nitrate in the soil. And again, if you look at these treatments, so the initial VC is just that site preparation treatment, and then the annual VC was the 5 years of vegetation control. Just a huge increase in terms of the amount of available nitrogen with the annual vegetation control treatment. That's not surprising. I mean, there's no vegetation there to take the nitrogen up. So there's just lots of nitrogen that's hanging out in the soil, and it's available for the crop trees to utilize. At the same time, some of it can be mobilized and lost because it's not being taken up. But generally, definitely increased nutrient availability to the crop. All right, so what does this mean though at longer term? So that was within like the first 4 to 5 years. And so we want, you know, things get a little crazy in the first couple of years after harvest. So you want to allow things to settle down so you can see more general trends and clear patterns. And so we went back after 15 years and remeasured the site again. And still saw some benefits of slash, in particular at the low quality site. So if you start just by focusing on the table in the upper right corner of the slide here, I'm not showing absolute values, but these just indicate on a relative basis the response between the treatments. So if there's a negative sign, that means that annual vegetation control had a negative effect on that element compared to the initial vegetation control. If there's an NS, that means non-significant. That means there's no difference between the treatments statistically. And if there's a plus, it means that there was a positive effect of that treatment relative to the other treatment. And so one thing that just point out very quickly is most of the effects that were significant occurred at the Matlock low quality site. There was only a couple that occurred at Molalla. In fact, one of them was opposite of what we'd expect. When you remove slash, it actually increased nitrogen, which we're still trying to puzzle through a little bit. But at the Matlock low quality site, generally, there was a lot of treatment effects, and they were generally negative. When you remove the slash and when you applied annual vegetation control, you had these reductions in essential macronutrients and also reductions in carbon, at least with the annual vegetation control treatment. You can see the absolute values, at least for carbon and nitrogen, in that picture on the left. So I've just plotted out absolute change relative to zero. So this would have been a pre-treatment value minus the 15-year value. And so a positive value means there was an absolute gain, and the negative value is an absolute loss. And generally things are increasing, but they were increasing more when you had when you had logging debris retention and only initial vegetation control treatments applied. So generally a benefit on soils. Okay, so what does that mean though for tree growth? Because that's ultimately what we're interested in. I mean, soils are really important. Clearly it has influence on immediate growth, and it's a great indicator of longer term kind of resilience, how you're setting your site up for future success or failure down the line, multiple rotations. But generally we're focused on the near term as humans. We want to know what's going to happen over the next rotation time frame. So looking at the individual tree, we actually went out, did these small manipulations where we placed slash around individual trees. And that picture on the lower left hand kind of shows an example of that. So that's where we had 80% slash coverage around a tree. We also did a 40% slash coverage around the trees. Then we did a 0% slash coverage. That was literally bare ground, not a piece of slash in proximity to the tree. And for the first 5 years, we went out and measured the effects on volume growth. And so this figure here on the right shows that for both of the sites. And first of all, it's very clear there's a vegetation control effect. So all the lines, the solid lines on the bottom, that's the initial vegetation control treatment, and all the dotted lines on the top of the figures is the annual vegetation control treatment. So if you just take the average of those, you can see there's clearly this positive effect of vegetation control. But what's interesting is when you applied those annual vegetation control treatments, there was also this effect of logging debris. And I have the circled symbols showing the 80% coverage. It wasn't large, but it was significant. There were significant increases in volume when we had 80% logging debris retained compared to either the 40 or the 0% treatment. So slash does appear to affect tree growth. But really what we're interested in is what happens to stand growth, right? We want to account for things like mortality and how many of the trees survived and what their overall volumes are. And so again, at 15 years, so longer term response, we went out and did that and measured volumes in each of the treatments at each of the sites. Now, there's some great data here and kind of like 3 or 4 key things I really want to emphasize for you to take away from this. One, so on the left is the low quality site, so that's Matlock. And on the right is the high quality site, which is Molalla. And so the first thing I just like you to take away is clearly there's a huge difference between the sites, right? And this reflects kind of what I showed you before about in terms of the site characteristics, the soil qualities being relatively higher at the Molalla site and lower at the Matlock site, such that it's over like a 3-fold difference. If you were to average out all those treatments, it averages out to about 70 cubic meters per hectare at the high quality site and about 20 cubic meters at the low quality site. So huge effective site. The second thing I want to highlight is that the low quality site had the most pronounced effects to the treatments. And we can see this, I've highlighted these in a couple different ways. So if you look at that, we're showing you the treatment combination. So if you were to average kind of those dotted lines that are shown in the lower portion of the figure, and then the solid lines in the upper portion of the figure, that'd be the effect of the vegetation control treatment. Where the upper lines are the annual vegetation control and the lower ones are the initial vegetation control. And that's a big increase. It's about a 2-fold increase in volume when you did initial vegetation control at that site. The other clear thing though is you can see that there's effects of the slash retention at that low quality. So again, that's where you look at the difference between those red bars that are showing the difference between those treatment means. And again, they're relatively large, about 40–60% higher when you had high amounts of slash retained compared to low amounts of slash. Okay, so effects are most pronounced at the lowest quality site. The last thing I'd like to point out is that if you look at the high quality site, even with annual vegetation control, if you retain your slash and apply just initial vegetation control, there's really no difference with an annual vegetation control treatment. And so it tells you, like, even, you know, that an investment of 5 years of vegetation control, which I'm sure you're all thinking is crazy, like it's a lot, it has to be a huge investment to do, and often not you know, justified. Well, in this case, even if you did it, it wouldn't have made any sense at all. It didn't really result in an increase in volume growth, as long as you retain the slash. All right. I did want to show Fall River. That's our third site in this series and the highest production one. I don't have the best data on it, but this is some recent data that Kim Lichty, again, a collaborator who leads the work on that site, has worked up. So she's done some tree ring analysis and looked at kind of how the ring increment has changed over time and in response to the treatments. And there's really just one key thing I want you to take away from this data. And that's if we compare these two treatments that I have outlined here, the bowl-only initial vegetation control, which is shown in orange, and the whole tree and annual vegetation control treatment, which is shown in green. And if you can see, up until about 10 years, the bowl-only initial vegetation control treatment was lagging. It was not doing good at all. And that was seen in a variety of different ways as well in previous analyses that we've done. But once you get to about 10 years, suddenly the pattern shifts, totally flips. And you get the bowl only having higher growth than many of the other treatments, and then ultimately kind of levels out with some of the other treatments, but still remains higher than the whole tree and annual vegetation. And so this is just a great example of, like, some of those early responses really aren't good indicators of longer term response. And what happened here is, you know, this was a highly productive site. It was planted at a relatively high density. And at about 10 years, it already had achieved crown closure. And so at that point, nutrient demand just exploded. And at that point, the bowl-only initial vegetation control treatment had the most nutrients. And so it responded favorably to it after 10 years. Just again, showing the benefits of slash retention and how they vary across sites. All right, one other thing that we looked at, and specifically at Matlock and Malala, we looked at another configuration of slash. So a lot of times, you know, people would say, well, we can't retain that slash in that way. There's no way people could plant into it. It's a huge fire risk. And so Tim Harrington, I give total credit to this, had the idea to say, oh, maybe we should test these mini piles of slash. So not doing these massive piles that people typically do, but just make these small mini piles. The mini piles are, you know, about 10 to 12 feet in diameter, maybe 4 to 6 feet tall. And they were placed throughout the unit. What was nice is that it still prepared the site for planting between the piles, and also really the increased fire risk with them was relatively short-lived. I mean, the piles within like 8 to 10 years had decomposed enough where they weren't really recognizable in the forest anymore. At 15 years, though, we went out and measured underneath those piles the soil characteristics, and then measured the soil characteristics in areas away from the piles. And really not that surprising, but there was huge pronounced differences in terms of the amount of nutrient availability underneath the piles compared to areas away from the piles. So this table is kind of showing that. We have, there was increases in soil total nitrogen underneath the piles compared to away from piles. There was increases in net nitrogen mineralization, which is the amount of nitrogen that's actually available for the trees to take up under the piles and away from the piles. And also magnesium was higher, and then soil phosphorus is higher too. Again, one of those essential kind of limiting elements that we typically think of as being really important for growth. All higher underneath the piles compared to away from the piles. What was coolest about all this is did some additional analyses and found that trees that were planted immediately adjacent to the piles had a 20% increase in survival probability compared to ones that were away from the piles. So it's not just that the piles are increasing nutrient pools, they're probably also doing things like altering competitive interactions. They're also probably increasing water availability, you know, some kind of large mulch effects under that, and that results in measurable increases in survival. All right, so just to quickly recap then, slash retention and these typical site prep veg control treatments can increase carbon and nutrients and generally increase site resilience over time. And you gotta think about this in context of relative to that annual vegetation control treatment and when slash is removed. In other words, if you didn't even do the site preparation treatment, there, you know, had no vegetation control, the responses could have even been more different. And so you keep it in context of what we're comparing. Growth and survival was highest with slash retention and annual vegetation control though. So it's, it's kind of a trade-off. On the one hand, if you do initial vegetation control only, you can potentially increase your soil pools, but at the same time, at least at the lowest quality site, you're going to have some pretty high mortality and low amounts of volume growth. And so it's definitely a trade-off, and you be thinking about how those practices are utilized in relation to site productivity, because there clearly was a large influence of site in response to soils, where most of the negative effects were associated with the low quality site compared to the higher quality site. All right, now I wanted to switch really quick to this thing related to Scotch broom. This has been pretty interesting thing that came out of the work. So for that experiment I just mentioned to you at Matlock and Malala, within a few years after treatment, it was observed there was a huge invasion of Scotch broom at the site. And it was just tremendous, to the point that we had to do some pretty drastic actions in order to save the experiment. Again, I'm guessing most of you are familiar with this horrible invasive species, but it's an end-fixing leguminous shrub, generally has high adaptations to our climate, can outcompete a lot of our native species, including tree species such as Douglas fir. Just not a good thing to have on a site if you want to have a productive forest. What was interesting at that site, at the Matlock site in particular, we saw that when you removed the slash, you actually had a much larger increase in Scotch broom abundance compared to where slash is retained. And so you can see that on this figure here. There's this large increase that was starting to pop right around 3 years. At that point, we knew that it was just going to explode based on Scotch broom ecology, that it was going to rapidly overtake the site. And so in year 4, we did an emergency treatment where we just removed all of the broom, regardless of what treatment it was assigned to. And for a while, it was okay. The broom didn't come back, but sure enough, over time, 10, 15 years suddenly, and it's right back where it was at year 3, except it's even more pronounced now. And so very lasting effect, very clear effect of slash retention on Scotch broom abundance, not only in the short term, but over longer time periods. That was such a pronounced thing, and Tim in particular took the lead on trying to validate mechanisms around it. And he found out that the slash actually alters the ratio of red to far red light, which alters the germination rate of Scotch broom seeds, and it has to do with things related to altered microclimate and how it influences Scotch broom germination. But those findings are promising enough that we decided to replicate the experiment again and see if we could find the same results. And so we went to a nearby site called Dry Bed Creek. Again, both of these sites are very close to where you're going to be tomorrow in Shelton. So you might see a very similar thing. And it saw the same thing, relatively high levels and low levels of slash. And then there was also some herbicide treatments that were placed on top of it. But I just want to focus on those slash treatments. You can see that there was a clear effect on survival. So one thing to point out is survival is pretty low overall. So back in, I think it was in 2015, there was a very large drought. I don't know if any of you remember that, but very, very pronounced extreme drought that occurred. And so mortality was just very high across the board because of that. But there still was a significant effect of the treatment, where you had about a 15 to 20% increase in survival when heavy slash was retained compared to when low slash was retained. And that was reflected in height and total volume growth as well. So those bottom 2 panels, you can see that there was the trees responded favorably to the slash retention. I should say at these sites as well, and I don't know why I didn't include the figure with it. Scotch broom followed the same exact pattern. That when you had the heavy slash, there was very low amounts of Scotch broom, and when you had light slash, there was very high amounts of Scotch broom. All right, I'm not going into detail on Scotch broom today, but I will just tell you that we've done a lot more work on it. So if you're interested in learning more about how horrible the species can be, we have a lot of data on it. It includes things like not just that can outcompete Douglas fir and kill it, it can actually alter soil nutrient pools. It can cause depletion in some of those pools, decreasing site productivity over time. There's evidence of allelopathic effects that happen where even once you remove the broom, it continues to cause detrimental effects to Douglas fir growth following its removal. And it definitely alters plant communities, both when it's present, it favors the, it favors its own growth, of course, but even when you remove it, it favors the invasion of other invasive species, causing a secondary invasion. So Scotch firs are a really horrible species, and I'd be happy to talk to you more about it at some other time if you're ever interested. All right, so I kind of just to pull this together is I think you got to come back to your objectives in the site conditions when thinking about if slash would work for you. It's not going to be a good fit for everyone. I think if you're at a site that's got Scotch broom present on it, and it's a low quality glacial outwash soil, such as was present at Matlock and the Dry Bag Creek study, you probably really want to retain your slash. But sometimes it's just not going to be a good fit. Again, like if you want to utilize that slash for biomass, if you're concerned about fire risk, a lot of the fires now, it seems like are kind of out of our control in terms of the disturbance patterns and when they happen, especially on the west side. I mean, they're still relatively rare, but they're certainly becoming more common and widespread. And when they do happen, they're pretty extensive. So you can see at a way how much slash would maybe contribute to that in terms of at your site. Insects, disease concerns, of course, and then a lot of times the things like the harvest system and just kind of cultural norms within the logger community is also going to drive that. I don't know how much control you can have on some of those things, depending upon the type of equipment mix and other things that are going to influence the way in which they go about conducting management activities. Okay, the last thing I wanted to kind of leave you with is just, forest conditions are changing. They are, there's no doubt about it. Climate change, we've already measured increases in temperature. We know there's extreme events associated with that. That heat dome last year was pretty pronounced and pretty dramatic. We also know that there's potential long-term effects of management. And again, I'm not talking about like at a single rotation, but multiple rotations. There's certainly potential for nutrient depletion of some key elements, in particular things like phosphorus, especially if you're on soils that are relatively old. And so it's just, there's a lot of uncertainty with that. At the same time, in forestry, we deal with uncertainty all the time, especially given the long rotations that are at play. So it's just dealing, recognizing some of those issues and trying to incorporate them in your management as best as you can. So generally, I think utilizing practices that have the greatest chance of increasing site resilience over time are a good thing if you can incorporate them into what you're trying to achieve. It's essentially you're building in and giving yourself more options down the line to deal with the unknowns if you have that capacity within your site, in particular within the soil. But at the same time, your management objectives are paramount, and that's going to drive and ultimately decide what you decide to do. All right, so the key messages, slash retention is generally a good thing. I'm certainly convinced of it after 15 years of conducting research on it, that in most instances it's a plus. I know there's real concerns about issues with, planting, the ease of planting when the slash is present and the possibility of fire and insect and disease. Those are very valid things, but in general, slash is a good thing in my mind. Vegetation controls definitely effective and necessary. It's, maybe the annual vegetation control is a little bit out of the realm of possibility of thinking about when you would ever need to do that. But going down the road, especially if you're thinking of like a resistance type strategy where you just want to keep doing the same old, annual vegetation control for longer than just a one-time deal might become more likely and needed as we go forward. The other thing, just again, coming back to that site quality thing, it's kind of paradoxical that our lowest quality sites, which don't produce the best amount of wood, require the most investment in terms of trying to have success, not just in terms of establishment, but ultimately having success in terms of achieving some kind of marginal volumes and ultimately achieving the objectives that you're trying to do with them. But that's just the reality, and it's got to be recognized if you happen to own land that aligns with those kinds of conditions. And then the last thing is just the Scotch broom. Again, the main message with that is it's just horrible. It causes lasting effects. If you got it, immediately and aggressively attack it. Do not let it sit there and establish for long periods of time and get into your site. And certainly if it's present and you're doing a harvest, make sure you retain your slash. That's it. I hope we have some time for some questions. I certainly have a few minutes before I need to get back to my other meeting. So thank you.
Thank you, Rob. That was a great presentation. I know definitely here in the South Puget Sound, we do have a Scotch broom problem. So that's some pretty relevant information for down here. We've got a couple questions already in the chat. The first one from David Peterson is, there's a concern about that these mini piles provide and other slash provides habitat for rodents to eat the seedlings. But the seedling survival in your trial for the mini piles was higher. So do you have any comments on that?
Well, no, I mean, my comment would be, as we all know, it always depends, right? So we try to present these things as if, it's a norm and it applies, but it always depends. So if you happen to have a rodent problem where your operations occur, where your land base occurs, and that's an issue, then yeah, that's probably not a good idea to do the slash piles. I could absolutely see that, but no, we did not see that in our study.
Okay. Second question from Paul Campbell. Do you think we would see equivalent effects for blackberry instead of Scotch broom?
Oh, well, we actually found, and I should have gotten more into this about the vegetation composition. Blackberry actually does pretty well on slash, but the way in which it competes with the Douglas fir is not nearly a concern as with some of the vegetative compositions that occur without the slash. So it's kind of interesting, because the slash creates like this structure that the blackberry can actually climb up, and so you can get high amounts of it. But the way in which, at least from Tim's work, he found that when comparing that composition to other compositions that existed when there wasn't slash, it was less detrimental than when you had removed the slash.
Okay, great. Another one from Terry Ketchum. Are mini slash piles burned or allowed to decompose naturally?
The whole purpose of it was to allow to decompose naturally. Yeah.
Okay, great. Any other questions? Oh, we got one. What does LD stand for?
Oh, I'm sorry. This is just a relic of all the different. I've been giving these presentations for like the last 10 years. We've switched and jumped around. Like I think I said quickly, maybe you missed it. I variously interchangeably refer to it as organic matter / logging debris, which would be the LD, biomass. I mean, there's so many different terms, but they're all the same thing. But yeah, LD refers to logging debris, which is the same thing.
Okay. Kathy says her Scotch broom was treated this year. Dead plants remain standing. How long do I leave those as they are? Is there a need to remove those?
No, once they're dead, you should be okay from that perspective. What the bigger issue is depending on how long the broom was there for, and really, I mean, this can be as short as within like the second year, if they become sexually viable and they're producing seed. That seed, if you get a seed bank present at your site, man, you got to keep at it. You got to keep aggressively hitting it as it sprouts up, because the seed can remain viable for like 50 years in the soil. And that's the major barrier to effective Scotch broom control. People think you can hit it once with herbicide and be okay. And there's always a huge seed bank underneath that. I mean, the amount of seed that an individual plant can produce is just, I mean, it's tremendous. It's quite scary, and it's ballistic. I mean, if you've ever been out there on a hot day, when the pods pop, they're sending that seed, 15, 20 feet out from where they are. So even if you have it close to your site, there's a chance you can get back in there. But dead plants themselves should be fine. The only thing is this allelopathic effect I mentioned, there's some limited evidence that it might continue for longer periods of time if the plants are retained and left on the site, but it's not clear if that's the case. And the amount of cost and effort it would take to remove the dead plants doesn't seem worth it.
Okay. Brady Deer says, do the benefits of slash retention level off or decrease with higher tons per acre, like a harvest of an older stand would have?
Yeah, that's a tough one. We haven't gotten into differing levels. These studies, when they're set up, like I said, they're relatively high, relatively low. I think as with everything, there's some threshold for sure. What that magic amount is, It's more than what we had when we removed, and we still had a decent amount of slash on the site. So at the same time, yeah, I mean, if you got an old stand that's harvested, there's a lot of breakage when it happens. There's already a lot of downed woody debris. Maybe not as important to retain as much as you would compared to a younger stand with less breakage and less downed woody debris.
David Peterson asked, does Scotch broom provide a significant amount of nitrogen in the soil? Perhaps a few could be tolerated. You kind of answered this in one of your previous questions. Maybe the seed is.
So yeah, nitrogen's a limiting element for sure. All the negatives associated with broom is not worth the amount of additional nitrogen you can get in your soil from the plant. I mean, we're talking about maybe ways of trying to take broom biomass and make it into things like a compost or a biochar. If you're familiar with what biochar is, that we could maybe be a suitable feedstock for that because of its high nitrogen content. But I would not view Scotch broom as an effective means to try and do nitrogen management. I mean, no, it's not worth it. It'll fix that. It'll put more nitrogen in your site. No doubt about that. But the drawbacks of having it there greatly outweigh any kind of benefit of having more nitrogen in your soil.
Okay. Rhonda Kramer's wondering, what's the difference between the bole and whole tree removal?
So again, this is just, I'm using interchange, but I've really got to come up with a set of unified figures that always use the same terms on them. Bowl only is, this is because it's evolved over 15 years we've been doing it. We get hammered by reviewers and people about, oh, you're using the wrong terms when you're describing the treatment. So the original terms that we called the treatment was a bowl only treatment and a whole tree treatment. The bowl only was where we retained all of the slash, and the whole tree treatment was where we removed some of the slash. And so that's that high versus low treatment. Over time, we started calling it logging debris removed versus logging debris retained. And then now I'm referring it to the slash retained, slash removed. So I apologize for the confusion on that. That's simply just a relic of the various ways we've referred to it over the years.
Okay. Janet's asking, have you come across any slash management strategies that incorporate biomimicry, such as nurse log life cycles?
Oh, well, I mean, certainly we know that nurse logs can be really important for certain species, depending on which ones you're trying to grow. I mean, typically I don't think of them as like commercial species though. I mean, nurse logs are hugely important for like hemlock and Sitka spruce, stuff like that. I guess it depends what you're growing, where you are, and what you're managing for. But certainly large coarse woody debris is not a bad thing at all. I mean, to keep it around, those kinds of biological legacies are really important from a biodiversity standpoint. And if you're trying to incorporate other ecosystem functions like carbon management, then yeah, retain some big logs if you can.
Okay, and then Chuck Hollins asked, pull out Scotch broom or just cut it at the base? What was your treatment method there? Do you leave it only when there's no seeds on the broom?
So the timing, and I'm not really good with the herbicide applications. That was Tim's strength. I can get you more information though if you want like specific recommendations on chemical mixes. But generally, it's you nip it towards the base, and there's an actual it's a garland applied with an oil that allows it to hang on to the stem and then and kill the tree. If you're using a chemical method, pulling is also effective as well. It takes more effort, obviously, but if you don't want to use herbicides, I would certainly do it. Certainly, if it was a manageable level of invasion that you could get to it to pull it. But so the timing question is that's just more depending on when the chemical will be most effective, and the pulling one, it's probably just when the pulling is most easiest, which I would think would probably be, when the when soils are, I guess that's probably when soils are dry, I would think it would be easier, but I could be wrong. It depends on your soil type, is actually, I guess.
Yeah, probably. I don't know, Joseph, do you have a comment on that since you're with the weed control board?
Yes, I don't know if you can hear me, but Yeah, so for Scotch broom, there's a couple different ways. The best way I like to get rid of it is actually just cutting it and doing a cut stump application with either a glyphosate, Mazapure, Tricopure. Those all work. I also like using a product. It's called the Easy Eject Lance. It has a 22 shell that has a wax capsule with herbicides that keeps it all localized in the cambium, and it doesn't make it like a messy spray application or painting experience. But you also have to consider too your soil type as far as erosion, because the more root structures you're pulling out of the ground, the more disturbed your soils are going to get. So sometimes it's nice just to leave the root structure underneath, but if you leave the root structure, it will put out new stems, new suckers, and so it's good to put a herbicide on it just to make sure it doesn't grow from the root system. And yeah, the seeds it's about 40 to 60 years, generally speaking. So as long as you get rid of those adult plants producing seed, it makes your control a lot easier.
Okay, thanks. I'm not seeing any more questions for Rob here. So thanks
I have a
again
quick
for that.
question.
Oh, okay, Patrick, go ahead.
If we've got time, Rob, one thing I'm just kind of wondering is, did you have any issues finding tree planters that are willing to work in the logging debris? Was there any hesitancy expressed or difficulty finding a contractor?
So for these again, so our primary partners on these were Port Blakely, Green Diamond, and Weyerhaeuser. And so we haven't worked with small. On the realities of what you're getting, like of in terms of like in terms of like a small woodlot or smaller land base and having to actually contract with somebody to do this, I have no experience with that. So I don't know on a practical level, operationally, how reasonable it is. Port Blakely, Green Diamond, and where they were very interested in just understanding how it would influence the productive capacity of their land. So for like example, Green Diamond now has incorporated the slash retention, because they own large swaths of land up on the Olympic Peninsula. So they utilize it as like a broom management strategy for soil fertility. But yeah, I'm sorry, Patrick. Unfortunately, and that's part of my problem is like I try to engage with various landowner groups and types and people with different objectives, but I'm still learning kind of the ropes out here in the PNW. Despite me having been involved with this research for 15 years, I only got out here and started my most recent position in the last 2 years. So I don't know if it's practically achievable.
Oh, sure. No, but thanks for your answer. And if you ever, I'm sure there are willing landowners that will be willing to host research down the line. So you can always connect with me, and I could try to get that figured out.
I appreciate that. And if anybody on here, anybody else who hears about this would be interested in something like that, please do so get in touch with Patrick. My email is right up here on the screen. Feel free to get in touch with me directly. I would love to put, the more trials, whether even if it's just it's like a little case study, unreplicated thing at various sites, the more that we can get in and showing and learning more about, what sites does it really work? What are the, where the sites where it doesn't work, and what are some of the mechanisms that would lead to those different outcomes? I would just be very welcome to work with anybody who would be interested in doing that.
Patrick, this is Richard Pine from O'Neill Pine Company. We've left slash out for more than a decade, and while we've had some comments from tree planters about, this will be challenging, but we have never had anyone turn us down on planting because we left slash out.
That's great to know. Thank you, Richard.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's great to hear, Richard, too. I always kind of heard that anecdotally, too. And people say they can kind of plant into almost anything, nowadays. It seems like it's, when you look at the conditions that are planted into. But it's great to hear from your personal experience that that's the case.
All right, I'm not seeing any more questions. So Rob, the best way to get a hold of you is that email right there, right?
Yeah, email, yep. And then we can set, if people like to talk by phone, that's fine too. But right now we're kind of not in the office very often. So if you really want to get in touch with me, email is the best bet. And I'm pretty good about getting back to people pretty quick. So.
All right, sounds great.
And I'm sorry, I do have to leave. I've got another meeting that I'm in right now. But again, feel free to get in touch with me, and I'll get back to anybody with additional questions.
Thank you, Rob.
All right, take care, everybody.
You too. All right, so now we'll move on to our, there we go. All right, we'll move on to our next presentation. We got a little intro from Joseph already, but Joseph Shea is our next speaker. He's on the Skagit County Noxious Weed Board. He is the coordinator. He's lived in Skagit Valley since 1995. He grew up on his family's Key Angus beef farm on the Samish River. Sorry. He graduated with a bachelor's in environmental conservation with minors in geographical information systems and criminal justice. He's been with the Skagit County Noxious Weed Board for the last 7 years with previous experience in construction and with the Washington Conservation Corps. As the Noxious Weed Coordinator, he leads the Skagit Cooperative Weed Management Area Group, which has worked with partners in Skagit, Whatcom, and Snohomish counties to eradicate Japanese knotweed on the Skagit and Samish River systems. Additionally, the Noxious Weed Control Board and their partners have worked with over the last 20 years to successfully eradicate Spartina angelica, or the common cordgrass, which is a highly invasive perennial grass, from the tidelands of Skagit County. Really great. There's 154 listed noxious weeds in Skagit County, which Joseph works with on identifying and controlling. And today, Joseph's going to be talking about the various tools available for vegetation control and touch on how different tools and strategies apply best for plant species and landscape type. So take it away, Joseph.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'll agree that when it's read out loud, it sounds way longer. So, a little bit of a curveball, but I actually did get a new job in the last month, and so there's a little bit of a transition. So I'm still filling in with my last role for this presentation, but I am actually now the operations and lands manager for Skagit County Parks and Recreation. And so there's probably still be some overlap in the future, but I figured I'd still do the presentation since I've done that job for so long. But yeah, like we were talking about here, I'm going to talk about noxious weed laws, kind of our programs that we have, how it might affect you, and then I'll actually talk about some general strategies, similar to like the last conversation about maintaining slash and everything. I won't get as scientific, but then also I'll touch on some very specific plants that a lot of you are going to be dealing with if you're a forester, dealing with riparian areas or even agricultural environments. I stayed away a little bit more from poisonous plants or recreational or animal plants, but yeah, let's kind of go for it. All right, so if you didn't know already and you're a landowner, a couple things you need to be aware of, or you should know about. Not many people do because they don't necessarily think about it unless you're producing on your property, but there is a law, RCW 1710, Revised Code of Washington. So this outlines the basic laws for Washington State for noxious weed boards, how they operate, who can be in the board and everything like that. It also goes into how the board operates and legal fees and everything. And so that comes into WAC chapter 16750. And so this is actually where the weed list is. So that includes the plant species the list and the plant species in that list. It also includes the monetary fees, schedules, anything like that. So for instance, we are a regulatory authority, although it's very rare if there was a situation where a landowner wasn't controlling weeds that were affecting either forestry projects, agricultural lands, all sorts of different situations. But if it was shown to have an effect on those properties, they are somewhat liable depending on the plant species. So it is pretty serious in some places. It's a little bit more used in Eastern Washington. Obviously, there's a lot more agricultural properties out there of vast quantities. So still used here as well, just a little bit differently. And then you also have your WAC chapter 16752. This is where the actual quarantine list is. So obviously every time we put a weed on the weed list, it means it can't be sold necessarily. And so sometimes there's plants that are popular in the nursery environment. So butterfly bush is probably the best example. It does put economic burden, so they aren't allowed to sell that, and so we had to find some sterile hybrids. But generally speaking, most of the plants that are added to the noxious weed list are quarantined as well. So that means you can't be transporting them around the state. And that's why there are some programs that we'll talk about later to certify products, hay, things like that, so they can be transported to different properties. So zooming out a little bit on noxious weed management, I think something that we weren't very good in the early years of this type of work of conveying is integrated pest management. So a lot of what we used to do is let's just till it till it's gone, mow it till it's gone, spray it till it's gone, and it isn't as effective controlling plant populations for land uses that way. So what we try to do is use a combination of approaches that includes both chemical, cultural, biological, mechanical means to control plant populations, because we don't want to go back to a property every single year and spray for the same weeds. We want plant communities being able to be established to a mature stage where we don't have to maintain the properties anymore, because maintaining properties equals costs and it lowers your profit margins, but then also too, as a general landowner, it requires a lot more maintenance time for your property. So if you can use those tools together and use it through a long period of time, you can control these populations so it's manageable every year. So when you're looking at what you need to do for different plants, you've already kind of looked at your land use, what you want to do. You need to see what weeds are there and what their life cycle is, and that's going to determine kind of how you're going to plan to control these populations. Typically speaking, the ones that a lot of people miss are biannuals. So these are ones that have a 2-year life cycle. The first year, they're generally a rosette, something growing close to the ground, blending in with grasses, other shrubs, things like that. And then by the time you notice it, it's grown flower. So the second year, it's starting to produce seed. It's actually the least effective stage to control most weeds, especially for herbicides, as well as mowing, anything like that, tilling. And so a lot of times the best time to get rid of it is in that rosette stage where you can just grab it and pull out the taproot or something of that nature. Generally, it's somewhat easy to control. It's just hard to identify. And something to consider too is a lot of these plants came from across the ocean, from all sorts of different places, and so they can grow in a very different range of climates, environments, and so they can start to act like different growth cycles. The easiest one to get rid of is the annual. So that's a 1-year growth life cycle. So the picture there at the bottom is actually a policeman's helmet. It's very aggressive, prolific, but if you're able to mow it consistently or pull it consistently, it will go away. So we don't have to use herbicides. It's pretty easy and quick turnaround, and you can start revegetating a site pretty quickly. But generally speaking, very, very prolific with seed production, very small. They'll grab on your clothes, sneak into your sneakers, and you'll carry them off to other places. And also floods as well carry them very well. Then we get to perennials. So that's the ones that we're mostly going to be dealing with as land managers, because the others, you can use your equipment and just your general maintenance to keep the other ones at bay generally. But the perennials, they're going to be growing all year long. They spread by fragments, tubers, anything like that. And so it can make it very hard as a land manager to deal with those plants. And so a lot of times for large properties, people dealing with multiple hundreds of acres, you're going to turn to an herbicide approach to knock those plants down and then come back and revegetate, get some tree plantings going, maybe some biological controls. But generally speaking, a lot of these in the commercial realm are dealt with herbicides in some regard. So different control methods, just some basic tools here. Chemical control, you have your backpack sprayers. This is us actually out in the tidelands and along the Skagit River, crawling back, trying to find some knotweed and spartina. But that's just a general approach for large properties. And we're doing it in a much different way than a lot of people do. So we don't have big tractors with booms spraying crops or anything like that. We're actually going out, searching and destroying, going after individual plants and being very specific with our controls. Then you have your cultural controls. And so these are the things that are going to be helping you long term, but you got to get them established early in the project. So tree plantings, for anything like reed canary grass or trying to get above blackberries, you have to maintain it for 5, 10, maybe 15 years to get them to a mature state. So that way they're above kind of that mortality level. Also, another thing that's been more and more common, especially for Scotch broom down in the plains, things like that, are controlled burns to help maintain certain environments, prairie landscapes, things like that. But for sites that have old Scotch broom taken away and is having new seedlings coming up, fires have been a pretty effective means to get rid of those seedlings coming up. But then since you have a bunch of annual grasses, those will come back very quickly after the fire, whereas the Scotch broom won't. So that can help sometimes. Mechanical control. So this is, your tractors, your weed wrenches. These are uprooters, which what we have, and we'll be demoing those tomorrow on our trip here in Cedar Woolley. But this is just mechanical. You're just kind of smashing it into oblivion and moving on, or you're pulling it physically out of the ground so it can't keep producing. Very effective for woody vegetation, Scotch broom, butterfly bush, things like that, ivies, hollies, all that stuff. And then obviously annuals, it's very effective. And then biological control. This is a very fun way of controlling populations. If you actually look at the bottom left picture, it's just some bugs, some insects, root boring, seed boring weevils that we released on Scotch broom. And a lot of times we use biological controls like that, insects, to get a higher population of those insects in that area. And so they'll eat down those plants or stunt them a little more, and it won't make that site as productive. And it gives you a little bit of time to make a little bit more direct control measures. It's not really a good way to get rid of it forever, but it is a good way to kind of stunt it down. Obviously, you can get goats and other sorts of wildlife too that might be able to browse on the vegetation you want to get rid of. So this next slide, this kind of goes into a couple things that were mentioned in the last presentation, but monitoring is key. If you're not going back to your properties after you treated 1,000 acres, and you're not coming back to check and see if that was effective, to see if there's anything you missed, the next year you come back, you're going to be dealing with the same amount of plants because you never had that follow through. But you need to go out there, determine what your objective is. If you're going to produce wildlife habitat, if you're trying to produce timber, if you're trying to get pollinators, forage production, recreational land maintenance, so you got to figure out what your goal is. And then that will determine what plants are acceptable and at what levels. Especially for like cows or livestock or anything like that. Obviously, you're going to have a low threshold for poisonous plants and things of that nature. And then once you design that, you figure out what you're going to be doing, your acceptable limits, and then you design your plan from that, and you continue to monitor after you treat. That's the biggest thing, is always come back a couple months, a couple weeks after, and make sure everything's working, because like it was mentioned before, there might be a drought situation that might hurt a bunch of your trees you didn't anticipate. Anything like that. So being able to return to your sites and monitor the plants, especially at young ages, is very helpful. So scale of work, a lot of our work, we do all of the work from the tidelands all the way up in the mountains. You can see here, this is a picture actually of us on the river, Skagit River, a bunch of us treating knotweed on one of our larger sites, tree planted sites from before actually. And then the middle picture there, that's us surveying for Spartina. And so you can see we're looking for grasses in grass. And so it can be very monotonous, very methodical, but we have to be very consistent with our work. And I'll show you a picture in the next couple of slides that will show you that consistency. And then, that's our on the bottom picture there. That's our mapping programs we've been implementing. And that's been helping us a lot actually track our progress, because sometimes you go to a site, you do all these treatments, you do all these plantings, you come back and you're not really sure if it's successful. And sometimes that's why it's helpful to actually have physical data to help track and make sure that you're on the right track. All right, since there's probably a lot of foresters in here, this is something I just wanted to bring up. I don't have anything specific necessarily, but this is something our county's been wanting to get more involved on, is actually gravel pit certifications and gravel pit management. We have a lot of material in the valley here and a lot of material you want to make it available. There's new pits opening up, and it's one of the largest vector sources for invasive plants, especially the new tree planting areas, new sites, new road construction areas. If you have weeds blowing and falling directly down in your material, you're going to be passing it around. And so getting more serious about maintaining these properties and making sure that you're not transporting any seeds, because once again, that does fall back into the quarantine aspects, and there is a potential legal liability there if you're transporting weeds from one site to another. And so we're trying to get some programs going in the state as far as gravel pit certifications. I know the Forest Service still come and certify the pits for use on their properties and things like that. So it's just something to think about for the future. There is, however, weed free programs such as the Washington Wilderness Hay and Mulch program. And so this is actually used for any sort of hay, grain, anything like that being used for horses or something like that, mules on the backcountry on Forest Service lands. You have to have weed-free certified materials. So that's just to make sure that those weeds aren't going across borders. But that also does apply to other crops like winter wheat, things like that. And there is a website there that you can go to and look for those products as well. But something to think about. So one of our largest programs that was mentioned in the intro there is actually Spartina. I haven't done all the great work necessarily. I've been doing it for the last 7 years, but we've been at it for about 20 some odd years. And we really started seeing it becoming an issue in Skagit County in the 1996, something like that. And it was getting really bad in our tidelands, and it was encompassing probably 60 to 70, possibly more percentage of our estuary plantings or plants in the estuary in the Skagit Bay. They actually got to a point where they did a helicopter herbicide application over the whole entire flats, probably killed like 70% of the vegetation. But then over the next year, all the native came back and the invasives didn't. And now we're getting to a point where we probably find 5 1 foot by 1 foot plants over the entirety of the North Skagit Bay. So it's been a very, very good project. A lot of good partners. We've been super effective, and now we're finding just 1 or 2 plants across the area, because it's kind of one of these things where you're never going to necessarily eradicate a species from an open system like this, but it's kind of like cutting a piece of paper in half. You get it down to a point where you only have 1 or 2 plants, and you stay on top of it where it won't become a giant problem, and you have to have a lot more staff and infrastructure to deal with. What the plant kind of looks like, there's a couple different variants. The top right one is a mature plant. Depending on the water availability, the soil, they'll grow differently. And then if you look at the plants on the bottom right, all those little green things sticking up out of the sand, that's the same plant. It's just been covered up, and it hasn't had the ability to grow much higher, but it is the same thing. And if you look at that big picture on the left, that is it as well. It's that more lime, not lime green, but maybe a dull green or teal. You can see the sharp leaves. It's not the succulent there. But anyways, very hard plant to see. We had a lot of good coordination, but you can see how much effort we have to put in. This is a little clip, all those yellow and red lines. That's first and second passes out in Skagit Bay. And then you can see the bottom map there. That's all of our survey areas. So we're doing thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of on foot on these vehicle surveys. And so it's been a really good opportunity, and we're down to very close to eradicating it in the entirety of Skagit County. I think we have 4 or 5 sites now where it's eradicated, out of, I think, 10 total sites. So moving on to the next one. This is our other big project from Washington State Department of Agriculture. This is our knotweed program. So you see me there with the big giant knotweed leaf. There's 3 varieties, generally speaking, you're going to be dealing with. That's going to be giant knotweed, Bohemian knotweed, and Japanese knotweed. There are some potential name changes coming up, but generally speaking, giant is giant. Japanese is the normal one, and Bohemian is the hybrid. A lot of what we find in our county is actually the Bohemian and the giant. To give you an idea, a couple of our sites that we've worked on, I think we started our knotweed programs in the mid 2000s, like I'm talking 2005, 2004, 2006. But this is some data that I collected since I was here. So I think it's 2015 on the top. And then I think it's 2021 on the bottom. And you can just see that the densities have drastically decreased. Those hot spots are generally gone. We're going and finding individual plants now. You can kind of see the little blue dots. But previous to 2015, it's a different mapping program, but it was almost entirely knotweed going up the entire river. And it's actually one of the sites where we didn't do a lot of planting afterwards. And we saw a lot of native plants come in. Whereas there's some sites on the Samish River where we didn't plant, and we had a hard time in some of those areas getting that native plant recruitment. So we had to do a couple more partnerships and tree plantings with Conservation District and Skagit Fisheries, things like that. So Samish River, this is, I think, our map from last year, so 2021. But you can see the whole map has it, or as far as knotweed going down the river. But it has been drastically reduced. A lot of these areas that are kind of more blue are actually previous treatment sites and tree planting sites from either Conservation District or Skagit Fisheries. Land Trust has a couple properties out there too. But you see that one yellow area, that was a brand new site from this last year. And so that's why it's a higher density. But once again, just getting more and more landowners on board. One of our biggest concerns with Samish River with our knotweed control is actually that revegetation aspect and long-term agreements. It's just a little bit more dynamic, a lot more private properties than like Brandy Creek, who has a lot of state ownership. And so it's a little bit more of a bigger thing to tangle, so or to tackle. Skagit River. Now we have been expanding our work on the Skagit River with our cooperative weed management area. So that's Soxwell Tribe mostly, Skagit Fisheries Enhancement Group, Land Trust, Forest Service. Those are kind of our biggest partners in that group. And they've been helping us work downstream from the Skagit and the Sauk River confluence all the way down to Concrete. And the hope is to eventually connect all of the properties going down towards Brandy Creek. So we can kind of have a top-down control of these species. And that's actually one of our grant requirements, is that it has to be top-down control because it is so easily spread by the water system. And so that's why it's so important to get every landowner on the way down. And that's why it can be hard to get a lot of progress sometimes. But very cool program, a lot of good work going on there. There's a lot of knotweed downstream, and so that's why we're really focusing on those headwaters, those spawning grounds, things like that. All right, so I'm going to jump into a couple specific plants now, and feel free to put in some questions, and we can attack those at the end there. I don't know why the pictures are so bad in this one, but this is one to be aware of. It is in the area. It's starting to grow out in our tidelands quite a bit. And a couple of our lakes and ponds and swampy kind of areas. It's not great to get there. It's in the mint family, but it has about 2.4 million seeds per plant. And so if you're not quick to get after this, it can really take over, kind of like that top right picture. That's actually some irrigation canal there. And so making sure these aren't taking over small ponds and lakes. If you see a couple of these, just clipping them and keeping the seeds from falling in and producing is very helpful. You can do some aquatic treatments with some herbicides. I particularly use Polaris most for my aquatic applications, but we could talk more about chemicals individually. But once you see a couple, it will take over, so keep an eye on that. One specific to more forestry I've been dealing more with. I've dealt a lot with English ivy in the towns, kind of the lowlands of Skagit County. But old man's beard is becoming more and more of a problem in the upper reaches of the county. So I'm talking Concrete, Lyman, Hamilton, Birdsview, Darrington, all those kind of areas. So this is actually from a site up near Howard Miller Steelhead Park. And it's a very particular plant to get rid of. It's generally the same control as English ivy, but it won't translocate herbicide as well. And so I've been trying to use these herbicide shells I mentioned, and that will demo tomorrow, more with ivy. But it has a very, I would explain it as a cedar tree bark stem. So it doesn't fully connect and it separates everywhere. And it's a very disjointed cambium. Whereas if you cut like an English ivy, it's almost just like a tree. You have the hard center and then you have the live edge, and it's very easy to know how to apply. So anyways, I've done some foliar applications on this with some herbicide. I did trichopure, but I mostly did Polaris, and that worked. But stem injection or stem cutting, it seemed to not be very effective at all. Main goal is to get it off the trees so there's not as much windfall issues. If you're going to manage it on the ground, you're going to have a lot more work ahead of you. It's very aggressive along the ground, so it might. The biggest thing is keep it off the trees for me personally. Now going into English ivy, and these are all kind of related plants that are going to be affecting the same things, but obviously there's some windfall issues. This is off of Brit Slough. Some ivy definitely affected. They use helped produce some rot and kill these trees and fell over. But generally speaking, it's easy to control as long as you have the manpower equipment to do it. So if you can girdle it all of the tree, cutting each one of those stems, everything above the ground is going to die and fall down eventually. I wouldn't recommend pulling it right then. It's pretty heavy and it can fall on you. It's best to just let it fall on its own time. If it's on the ground and it's old enough and large enough, you can get equipment and almost roll it up like a burrito. Sounds kind of funny, but it does work. You can do also smaller ones by hand that way. I like to do that. It gets rid of all the organic matter there. It keeps any sort of barrier from herbicide treatment. It's just cleaner that way. It gets rid of it, makes it usable quicker. Then once you rip off that whole mat, you're going to have a whole bunch of these little babies come up in the next 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks. And then I'll come back and do some spot spraying if I need to. The leaves are also a little more susceptible to herbicide. They're not as waxy and thick. But generally speaking, you don't need herbicide to get rid of this. There's just a lot of manual labor. Once you get rid of all the materials on the ground, you just mulch and keep pulling it out of the ground, and you can do that. But if you want to do chemical, I do cut stump, the stem injection gun I have, the Easy Jet Lance, or if you're going to do a backpack sprayer, I would pull everything and spray the new seedlings coming up. Morning Glory, this one is the worst of them all. The rest can be taken care of mechanically as long as you're putting in the effort. Morning Glory, you're going to spread it by cutting it, digging it, mowing it. That's why it's all on that lawn there. Every time you mow, you're going to spread it and it's going to keep growing. This is one I haven't been super effective getting rid of without herbicides. I've done some mattings, some mats of vegetation and cardboard and plywood and plastic, and it always ends up growing out the sides, it seems. If you have anything under 10 feet by 10 feet, you might be able to get rid of it. Otherwise, I just treat the area, an herbicide, come back in 3, 4, 5 months, put down new grass seed, put down desired vegetation, and have that come up. Otherwise, you're going to have to deal with the soil and rip it out, and it's kind of a landscape approach. Once you have this at this extent, you just have to start fresh and re-landscape. Perennial grows all the time. Rhizonomous stem fragmentation is the big issue with this. Policeman's helmet, I mentioned this earlier, really pretty flower. It's got projectile seeds, but it's easily pulled out of the ground. You can kind of see in that top picture the shallow root system it has. But easy to control, but it can take over a treatment site. If you're doing any work along the river, especially the Sauk River, and there's a flood and you have bare grounds, this might pop up very much everywhere. So just be aware of it and get rid of it early so you don't have to manage it. Garlic mustard, for you forest nuts out there, this is something we're really worried about in our county. It's not super prolific everywhere, and there's a couple places along like the South Skagit Highway where we've seen it pop up. It could be a real problem for forests. If you look in the bottom right picture, it's the only thing growing in the understory. There's no seedlings growing. All those alders are dying. They're pretty young. I mean, I'd say about 10, 15 years old, maybe. And it's killing all those. It has that allelopathy, very similar to what was mentioned earlier. But to identify, it's got this white flower. It's in that mustard family, so it's got that iconic kind of mustard seed at the top. But if you crush the flowers and the leaves and everything, it'll smell like garlic, and you can make a pesto. But it's a big problem potential for new forested areas. So keep an eye out. If you do see it, call our office. We'll get out there. We have some grants available to help landowners with it. I'm going to slam on through here. This is one that wasn't mentioned earlier, but the Scotch Broom was brought up. But this is in the same realm, same family. But this is the mean second removed or twice removed a cousin. I don't know. It's got thorns, ginormous thorns on it, could be 2 to 3 inches long that are just razor sharp, and it grows all throughout the whole plant. So you can't grab it, you can't move it, you can't get in there to use tools. It's a very nasty plant. I found 3 plants in Anacortes. That's it I've found for our county. Island County has quite a bit. San Juan County has some. So this is one we want to really not let go in our forest lands, especially in our transmission ways, because not only do you have to pretty much get rid of Scotch broom, but it's Scotch broom with 3-inch thorns on it. So we want to keep this out of here. It dries up and it's much denser than Scotch broom as well. So it burns at a higher rate. So if there's a bunch of it, it's a bigger fire hazard as well. Pretty easy to get rid of though. You can burn it. You can spray triclopyr over it. That works too. I'm not a huge fan of foliar spraying triclopyr over Scotch broom. I'm a bigger fan of cut stump and stem injection, just as a little cleaner, and you get the instant gratification of the plant being gone. And like was in that comment, you have dead plants there, so well, you still have to go and pull them because otherwise you're gonna have dead plants. It may not germinate or have a spreading ability, but it's still not going to be aesthetically pleasing or anything like that. But you can pull it out. I would always recommend that, just so it doesn't look that bad. Going to Scotch broom, same thing. So that picture there, they're obviously using burning a lot more for seedlings. Those are all probably 1-year-old seedlings, 2-year-old seedlings, popping up there by that fire guy there. But Scotch broom is a big problem for erosion issues, for right-of-ways. There's a lot of people with pollen issues with this. So they have allergies. It's very visible. But it does provide some habitats for bees and things like that. But we just need to find a different alternative. But going through this, if you look at the hill by the house, for that, any sort of forestry lands, I really don't recommend just pulling it, because especially if you're going to have a rain soon after, a lot of Scotch broom work gets put into the winter because a lot of your crews, they're not spraying in the winter or anything. So a lot of your manual removal, mowing, pulling, things like that end up going into the winter. And I don't necessarily recommend pulling them out of the ground, because you do have a higher potential of erosion, and I've seen a couple sites with that. But if it's in your rock pits, let's get rid of it. Don't want to spread it around. We don't want 40 years of seed in our rock. So, all right, so here's some butterfly bush. Pretty easy to identify. If you flip over the leaf, it's a little bit silver. You can see that picture in the center and the top there pretty easily. Obviously, the flower is the biggest tell, and the seed's the biggest tell for this. But if you look at that, that's all along the river on Grandy Creek. So we've done a really good job of getting rid of all of our knotweed. But like was mentioned earlier, we're having other invasives come in its place after control. And butterfly bush has been one of those. And it's mainly just because it's really good at the seed production. Birds grab it, and then it flows really well downstream. So even the Skagit River is getting just absolutely taken over by butterfly bush. It smells good. It is good for pollinators, provides good cover. But it just outcompetes all the native vegetation and creates monoculture, very similar to the other plants we're trying to get rid of. But there are some sterile hybrids that are sold now. But generally speaking, what you're seeing out there in the rivers, that's from the past. All right, I'm gonna get into geraniums a tiny bit real quick. There's a couple different ones here. So there's shiny geranium and then herb Roberts. So this is actually from the Bayview Cemetery. There's a whole bunch of shiny geranium. Now it spreads very prolifically. It spreads by fragmenting projectile seeds. And the biggest issue for these is we're worried about them taking over kind of subalpine grasslands and flower areas, things like that. Because they do, especially with herb Roberts, they do grow alongside the roads of these more alpine or forested areas. But it takes over the ground. It has the allopathy as well, so it won't let anything else germinate next to it. And eventually those create giant mats where that's the only thing there. Like this road is just on top of this plant because it just grows so prolifically. It's not really a huge ecological issue, I guess, in some ways. It doesn't have as much of an infrastructure issue or poisoning issue or anything like that. It's mainly just a worry for a lot of our protected grasslands and flower areas, things like that. So here's giant hogweed. Some of you have probably seen giant hogweed around. There's a native plant, cow parsnip, that looks very similar, but it's about half the size. Cow parsnip will be maximum about maybe 8 to 10 feet tall, but giant hogweed's grown up to 15 to 20 feet. The hogweed there on the left is actually what I found in anacortes, and this is the stuff that if you touch, it'll actually give you some burns. It makes your skin photosensitive, and those burns can be active for about 6 years, and the scarring can last upwards to 20. And so if you get that sap, it gets absorbed in your skin, and it'll keep getting sunburnt and blistered every time you go outside until all that skin has, kind of died and fell off. So it sounds gross, died and fell off, but just general shedding. The flower is probably about 2-3 feet wide. The leaves themselves can be about 5 feet wide. So it's a very ginormous plant, but it can be confused with the native cow parsnip, which also will give you the burns, maybe not as extensively, but those are found very much on in anacortes area along the roadways. And then also it kind of grows in the same areas that like Devil's Club would like to grow sometimes, kind of moist, frequently sprayed areas, things like that. So perennial, produces by seed mostly, but there are some chemical stuff that you can do with this. I recommend just spraying it because there's no reason touching it or messing with it, getting into your clothes. Animals can technically eat this, but I just recommend spraying it. Don't touch it and just let it die where it is. There's no reason getting burnt for a plant. Okay, so poison hemlock's another one I want to touch real quick. So this is something that's getting worse in our county. But if you look at the left there, it's got this purple splotching along the stem. You can see, and then it also has that white flower. Has a very ferny-like structure. This is a background picture that's from the first year's growth. This is biannual. Can act like an annual, but there's a couple natives that you should look at or know of. So there's also Queen Anne's lace or wild carrot. That's in the middle there. It has a very unique umbel because it'll actually close up like a cup in the mornings and the afternoons, whereas the others don't really have that much movement in their umbel. And then the one on the right is water hemlock, which is also poisonous for livestock. And so all these are not good for livestock, and you don't want it in your water systems or in your hay fields. It's one thing to keep an eye out for, but it does also give humans rashes as well. So just something to think about. I'm gonna go a little quicker here just to have some time, but we're also Tangy Ragwort. It's not as big of an issue as it used to be. I've seen a lot less, but in the siege woolly to concrete area, that's probably where you're gonna find the most of it. Also kind of towards Stanwood, there's quite a bit as well. So something to think about if you have livestock, but it's obviously being ignored by the animals and being eaten around. But once you stress out the animals enough or you mow it, they will come and eat it. And then also if it's failed in their hay, it's also poisonous still in their hay. So something to think about if you have any livestock around. And then also the clear cuts are very good at producing Tangy Ragwort as well. It'll have that white, tough flower, and up in those clear cuts, they'll just blow and just take over. It does really good in those dry soils, elevated, poor soils. So. Canada thistle, I'm not going to touch on this too long, but don't let this get established. You're going to have to do a chemical approach mixed with some big mechanical tilling, seeding, things like that. It's a kind of a larger thing to get rid of. Once you get it to that seed stage where it's all white like that, you don't want to mow it or be in it at all. You're just going to spread things. If it has any flower structure at all, just don't mess with it. You're just going to make it worse. It's going to clone out from itself. But if you mow it, you're going to let the seed go as well. So as long as you get it mowed and cut down before any flower structure is there, and then maybe do a chemical treatment on it, there's kind of a little longer plan for this. But it's class C, you don't have to get rid of it, but it is a problem. Bull thistle, this is a biannual that I mentioned earlier. You can see the rosette on the right. This has a lot more elongated leaves with the thorn on it. And so it's a lot easier to get rid of. Just don't let it get established. You pull it out in the rosette stage, and you'll actively control it. You can use chemicals, but like I said, pull it in the rosette and you'll get rid of it. Also, just generally mowing bull thistle down nonstop will get rid of it. As long as it doesn't get to flower stage, then don't mow it as well. So And once again, all these, they can take herbicides, and we can talk about that later. There's all sorts of herbicides around, but I won't necessarily give it on this presentation. Italian arum is another one to worry about, especially in plantings. If you're buying a house, anything like that, these are taken over. It has these tubers that just break off in the ground, and even if you did spray an herbicide, it can't translocate to that tuber because it's fragmented from the root structure. And so it's a very hard one to get rid of. It's a combination of going through soil and silting it out like our archaeologists, and then chemical treatments, and doing that for multiple years. That's the best way to get rid of it. Otherwise, you're gonna have to take out the top 6 inches to a foot of soil and replace it. So kind of a nasty one. Also gives you photo burns as well, or rashes from handling it. Reed canary grass. So this one's everyone's dealing with. Very simple solution. You just have to wait 20 years, 30 years. So you can do chemical mowing around tree plantings. You can do physical mowing, but generally speaking, you're not going to get rid of it. It's not worth the time. The main thing is get it cut down and manageable. Get rid of that giant mat of vegetation that it's built up, and then you can plant and then keep it maintained for the next 5 to 10 years. And then your trees will mature to a high enough stage that they can start shading out those areas of Reed canary grass. And this is something we're dealing with on some of the Samish River sites. There's just not a lot of vegetation around the edge. So a lot of canary grass comes and takes over. So if you want to get rid of it long-term with trees, is really the best way to do it. Himalayan Blackberry, I hate this stuff. I don't want to be used for anything. It just takes over, destroys things, makes anything cost twice as much to manage or do. Your staff takes twice as much to do anything. It's not, I mean, maybe it's got some good nutrient aspects like you guys were mentioning earlier, but I don't recommend it as a substitute by any means. But anyways, best way is to get rid of this. I like to mow it all down. A lot of times you're going to have a thicket 5, 6, 7 feet tall. Mowing it down to knee high, letting it regrow for about a foot, maybe a foot and a half, and then going back and doing the chemical treatments are very effective. You can also just continually mow it. You can go through after you mow, maybe keep about a 6-inch deck and pull out all the hearts, or you could do cut stump on the hearts. So you have the main root system going into the ground to the heart. You don't want to pull it out, and you can just cut it while it's still moist, paint the stem, and that'll kill that heart and it won't regrow from the heart. So many ways to get rid of it. It just takes a lot of effort. You see that picture on the bottom left? That's a good example of us going through and just grubbing out a whole bunch, and then all those sticks sticking up are hearts, and we went back through and cut stumped those. You could also spray them as well, but don't need to have spray, just need to be consistent with the mower and mulching, and then make sure that when you put in your desired species, you really have to be aggressive with your maintenance because the blackberries will kill them and take them over or climb over them. Just like, you know, a Sitka spruce or any sort of conifer that's like 5 to 10 years old, blackberry loves grabbing onto those and climbing because then they can get even higher up. So get rid of blackberries. We don't need them. Put in some Nuka Rose or something else. That's just me. We can disagree. There's right opinions and wrong ones, right? But anyways, a couple of nice sites to look at if you're able to. There's the top one's the Noxious Weed Control Board website for the state, and they have a big picture key of all the different weeds. They say how to get rid of them. If you're from a different county, they have contact information for the different people, the different counties. Really good resource just for education outreach. And then you also have the invasivespecies.wa.gov. That one's really helpful as well. They just go over the invasive species in the state. And that's not just plants, it's also insects and shellfish and all that stuff. And they got some really interesting ones coming in. The Pacific Northwest Handbooks.org/weed, that's probably the coolest and most helpful. And I'm actually gonna switch over to that and show you. If you are unsure about chemicals, this is the website you've always been looking for. Let's see if I can get it up here. Okay. Okay, so I think you should be able to see my browser now, but this is the Pacific Northwest Pest Management Handbook. And if you have any plant pests, crop pests, whether it's diseases, insects, whatever, pesticide safety questions, you want to know what to use, all that stuff, this is the place to go. So if I went to weeds, and I think I should be able to just type in, let's say tansy. Oh, that's not it. Now it's going to give me the biocontrol agents for tansy, their roles, everything. I'll click this. Let's tansy, common tansy. This is another, it's not the one I was necessarily looking for, but anyways, that gives you the rate, what products you could use, the time of year, everything like that. So if you're ever interested and you want to try it for a specific thing, you could type your species in here. It'll give you all the different ones you could look at in different rates and different land uses. So just a helpful thing if you're ever wondering about that. It's hard to remember chemical info, but Pacific Northwest handbooks.org. So that's kind of about it for me. But yeah.
All right, thanks, Joseph.
Open to any
That was
questions? I can get into the question thing here. Hold on. Howard is saying there used to be a lot of gorse around old forts. Most of it's gone now. Very cool. That is effective. How does butterfly disperse its seeds? Yes, so butterfly disperses by its seeds. It's its number one way of dispersing. It can get ripped out of the ground and resprout if it's covered up, but generally speaking, it's just the seeds for that one. Water parsley, native and not poisonous. Looks like a lot of poison hemlock and grows in similar conditions. Yes. Yeah. So that's the thing. There are natives that are edible. It's just a lot of people don't take the time to know the difference, and so they get confused. Herbicide product names for triclopirid are imazapyr are. Oh, product. So I use, I think it's called Garlon 4A or 3A. That's what I use a lot for just woody vegetation, just blanket woody vegetation. I've been using Vastland is another product. Now that I mostly use in hayfields or ag lands or grazing property. That's a triclopyr product that's approved for hayfields. So I'm not sure if Garlon is, but another one to look about at if you have a larger property is Milestone. It's commonly added to 2,4-D or triclopyr products as an additive. And then Imazapyr, the products I use are Polaris. That one's aquatic approved, like Polaris, like the Razor or Polaris jet ski, or I don't know. But Polaris is the name brand. It's a aquatic approved for knotweed and other species, broadleafs, but it's a non-selective and it'll go after grasses and everything else. There are some other name brands for Imazapyr, but that's currently what I use. Since Canada thistle is a perennial, it is valuable to spray, or is it valuable to spray in the late summer, early fall? Yes, so actually, yes, I've done both. The most effective is early spring, but if you wait past when it has seeds and flowers in fall and you have a nice clean dry day, I spray for in the fall too, because it seems like there's new plants that come up that are green and susceptible versus some of them are dying off. So anyways, Canada thistle, yes, I spray in early fall as well. It's just harder because of the weather. But absolutely, that's a good idea. Yeah, sorry, I'm just kind of blasting through it here, but I think that's all the questions.
that's all I see so far. I think just to go back to one of them, Joseph, you were mentioning some names of different herbicides, and maybe one thing to talk about is making sure your herbicide is labeled for the use you want for the location.
Yes. Yeah, so that's why I was saying for like the Imazapyr, the Polaris product I use, it's labeled for aquatic applications. So it's a little bit more strict on where you can use it, obviously. or I guess it's approved for aquatics, so you can use it just about anywhere. Now, if you're just using one for agriculture, it may not be approved to be used near water. So yeah, just always check the back of the label. As we say, the label is law. And so just read the label, make sure it's approved for your use. But what I recommend, if you aren't familiar, or if you're not a licensed person, there are licensed professionals in our county. I work a lot with Skagit Farmer Supply, also Wilbur Ellis, also Cenex. They all have agricultural people that do a lot of spraying and are chemical consultants, and they'll let you know what's available for you as a homeowner, but then also what it can be used for, what it's approved for, and they can help you go through that. So yeah.
Great. All right, Patrick, I see you're unmuted. Do you have another question for Joseph?
I do, yeah, and I'm getting an indication of an unstable internet connection, so I hope you can hear me. But I was just curious, I heard you mention the cut stump treatment a lot for the woody perennials. Do you ever use the frill or hack and squirt? And is there, a reason that you do or don't, or you find one is better than the other?
I have a two-pronged answer to that. The first is professional side. I guess I'm not a huge fan of hack and squirt or whatever. It's a little axe or whatever, and you cut and dump it in. It's just a little dirtier. It's harder to stay clean while you're working, especially if you're doing a lot of it. And that's just my opinion. It works fine, but just as the cleanliness aspect, also a PR aspect, the tools I use now are just a lot easier to sell and to be able to talk with landowners about. That's why I really like the EasyJect lamps, because it's all just so localized and clean, and it just has a good aesthetic and it does the job. Whereas hack and squirt, it's not as perceived as well. And I don't know if you guys have seen was it Fire in the Night or Fire in the Sky? But anyways, they're out there hack and squirting, and one guy gets abducted by aliens. So I stick away from it now.
Thanks. Yeah, no, that's helpful. I'm not as familiar with the EasyJect lamps, and I don't know what the cost is. I know obviously hack and squirt, it's just an axe or a hatchet. But I was just curious if that is as effective as that lance in your experience.
Yeah, the lances are pretty expensive. You're talking about $700 per lance. Each lance, there's a small and a large one, and we'll see one of those tomorrow in the field trip. But I think it holds somewhere 500 plus shells, and you do a shell every about 1.5 inches around the diameter of the tree, or shrub or whatever. But it's pretty clean and effective, and I like it. But I see other situations where hack and squirt can work just fine. But yeah.
Great, thank you.
I have a question as well. Down here I come across a lot of English holly. What would be your recommendation for dealing with that?
Yeah, so same thing with the EasyJect lance. I mean, it's I love it. It makes everything so much easier. With holly, you're dealing with the same issues. If you cut it, it's going to send up suckers. If you let it fall over, the branches are going to grow into the ground. It's just a mean, crazy plant. So I like to just go through, and if I'm able to, I just EasyJect lance into the tree that's there, and it's going to die and fall and erode right there. I don't have to do anything else. Otherwise, my number two would go cut it about 4 inches off the ground, then do a paint cut stump treatment, and that would keep those suckers from coming up. And then you got to go hang the plant up in a tree to keep it from touching the ground. And it's a pain. So I just like the EasyJect lance. It kills it right where it's at. Doesn't affect any of the plants around it. Doesn't have any sort of leaching that I've noticed through the root system to other plants near it. So that's what I like to do. So